Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan. Back again.
And we're still on produce safety.
Right. So last week we talked a lot about water quality and how important it is. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about what you can do with those water quality tests and why it's important, and maybe a little bit about how to set up a food safety plan for your farm.
That's right. And so we're talking about a farm food safety plan, and there are templates that you can follow. Ohio State does provide one of the templates.
Now, as we talk about this template, keep in mind that it is just that. It is a template, something to give you ideas, how you could word things, and to help guide you. So it's just a template. These are not guidelines or requirements.
Right. But basically, it starts off with a policy for the farm, and it states, our pharmacy understands that food safety is our responsibility. Our farm is committed to providing our customers with safe, quality food by implementing and maintaining practices that address biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And we talked about what those are a lot of times in water. And, that is kind of the big danger, as far as potential food safety risks. And that we will provide the necessary staff training and resources needed to carry out and maintain all tasks associated with food safety policies and procedures. So they're kind of highlighting food safety and how it's so critical as far as making sure things are clean from start to finish. Because when we talk about microbial contamination, we have to understand that these things replicate so quickly, and the earliest that if you get contamination early on, it has more time to become at a level where it can cause harm down the road when it's consumed. So it really does start at the farm. And a farm food safety plan just highlights different ways that we're mitigating it from the start to the finish.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the most important steps in your food safety plan is to identify a human being who is going to be the contact for all food safety issues. Now, if you are a one-person farm, well, you're that person. But if you have multiple people on the farm, it's very important to identify and name the person who is the farm food safety contact. That person especially needs to have adequate training to understand the different risks that could be mitigated and what steps they can take to do the mitigation. So it's very important to identify your person, and that will be the first thing you're going to have in your farm food safety plan after your statement of, hey, this is a farm food safety plan.
Right. And then one of the first things you start with the farm food safety plan is the farm health and hygiene policies. And under that section, it states all workers are trained on company produce safety policies that start work at whatever farm you have, you can fill it in there, and receive a refresher training annually thereafter. Workers include paid employees, volunteers, family members, interns, contractors, and consultants. So if you have a small family farm and your family helps plant, cultivate, and harvest the crops, they need to understand that food safety is a concern, especially when we're talking about produce, and they need to be trained on hygiene procedures. And the food safety template that Ohio State provides does require them to do it annually. So just have an annual training on the policies of what to do. Like, so you wake up, you're feeling sick. You probably shouldn't go harvest the crops that day because you're a source of contamination. You have, I know it's not the best visual, but you wake up having diarrhea. Probably shouldn't be on the processing line at post-harvest. But also, how often should I wash my hands? Where are the hand washing stations? You might have somebody that just doesn't work there as often. You get a little extra help during harvest, and they need to know these things so that contamination doesn't occur.
Well, and you also have to provide hand washing stations. A lot of our local farms, our small farms, have fields that are scattered about. And if you are working in a field and you have people working out there with you, there needs to be restroom facilities and hand washing stations within, I believe it's a quarter mile or within 5 minutes. You have to be able to get to a facility where you can use the bathroom in a sanitary way, and then also to be able to wash your hands. And remember, hand washing facilities need to use potable water. And it's really important to have it. It's so easy to create a field hand washing station that there's no reason you shouldn't. All you need is one of those camp bags full of potable water, some hand soap, some paper towels, and a trash can. And woof, there you go. You have a hand washing station. And, you sneeze into your hands, or you find some produce, you didn't realize it was next to some feces in the field, and you touch that. Well, you need to wash your hands now so that you don't spread that to other things. And so having that hand washing facility in a nearby location that's close enough that people are actually going to use it can really make a difference to the sanitation of the produce that you're harvesting.
That's right. And it's a critical thing, especially in that kind of environment. Again, trying to keep things clean from start to finish. Things like break policies are also highlighted in the Farm Food Safety Plan. So things like eating, drinking, smoking, use of cell phone must be taken in areas away from the production fields, because your phone isn't the cleanest thing.
Oh no, phones are disgusting.
So you start handling your phones, you start, it's a break time. So, going to the bathroom, you need to make sure that these things have a dedicated place and there are proper sanitizing things afterwards that you can do. Smoking's another one.
Right. And it just sort of helps break it up and make it very clear to your workers, hey, it's break time. Go sit down, relax, get in the shade, have a pop-up so that they can be in the shade. It's going to help your workers recognize, hey, it's break time. You should be relaxing, refreshing yourself, hydrating, and that's going to keep your employees healthier as well. And so that's a really important thing, that when you're looking at your break policy, make sure that they're taking a break. It's really easy when you're getting in the groove and you're just going to just sort of get into the Zen zone of you're not paying attention to how much time has passed, and 6 hours can go by and you're still working, and all of a sudden you're feeling woozy and dizzy, and it's because you haven't taken a break to go get some water or get in the shade, and now you're overheating and you feel like you're going to pass out, and so now your productivity is going to drop off for the next 2 hours, whereas if you would have just taken a break at a certain time, you wouldn't have that lost time.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of health and taking care of your workers and, of course, yourself, too. But we talked last week a lot about water assessment. That's the next big section when you're talking about your farm food safety plan. You've done water tests. If you're using groundwater or surface water, and you have steps in place to help maintain water quality for pre-harvest and post-harvest water. Again, post-harvest water, you must be compliant if you're a very large farm from 2023 forward. But other things you can do is to, just identify where the potential risks are for your water. So hopefully you have your farm map and you recognize where your water sources are, where there may be crossing over areas of potential contamination. If it's surface water, is there a large goose population at your pond? Are there livestock that are drinking straight from the pond? Those are things that could potentially increase the amount of contamination in that water. What are you doing to treat that water? Those are all things that you need to include in that.
And following that section, animal, wildlife, livestock assessment. So this is kind of interesting because they break it down into 3 options. 1, we don't have livestock. Our productions are in areas not located near adjacent dairy, livestock, or fowl production facilities. Domesticated animals are not permitted in the field. Domesticated animals are part of that as well. Another option is that there is, whether it's a dairy, a fowl, or beef production, that there are boundaries that could cause some blending of livestock with produce. And in that situation, you have to assess the risk. Like, is there a lot of runoff? Do you see erosion? Are you growing something nearby that could cause contamination concern? So you assess that and you figure out best ways to mitigate that problem. The third option is we used mules/horses in our fields. And according to the Ohio State Farm Safety Plan, it states working domesticated animals are not allowed in the field 120 days before harvest and must stay on the field alleys or off roads. So that's because these animals are producing waste and you don't want that contamination so close to harvest. But it further states that waste from working animals is picked up with a shovel as soon as possible, put into a covered bucket so that it doesn't recontaminate the field. But they do specify 120 days before it's harvested.
So when you're looking at your working animals, it's really critical to take steps to protect the fresh produce that you're harvesting. And, a lot of horses, they'll have the catch pockets for the manure that's falling so that it doesn't hit the field. So, there are steps that you can take. And remember, when we're looking at our food safety plans, we recognize that there is no way to eliminate all risk. There will always be some risk, but you're trying to reduce it as much as possible. And so if you are needing to, say, harvest potatoes and you're using a drag plow to pull them up, when you are using your animals to do that harvest, take those precautions, and write out what steps you're doing to protect that produce during that harvest time if you do need to use your animals in the field.
And speaking of animals, that kind of leads us into soil amendment assessment, right?
Well, before we go into that, I did want to talk about making sure that you recognize what's going on your neighbors' farms. You may be doing produce production and have no livestock or not use work animals, but your neighbors have a hog farm or a dairy, and they have a manure lagoon at the top of the hill. What is that risk that lagoon fails? How is that going to impact your farm? And what steps can you put in place to protect your produce in the event of a heavy rainfall or failure of one of their walls? So things like that, you really need to consider, what could happen and what are you doing to protect your farm during those times?
Yeah, because heavy rainfalls are something that we need to be aware of because they're happening
more frequently,
a lot more frequent than they used to.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to have that plan in place because you could very much have a runoff event of something like a manure pit onto a field. And the closer you are to harvest, the higher the risk, but you have to have a plan in place for that. Is there another place you can grow something that would be a little bit less risky, like slightly off the ground? So if there is a runoff, you can see where I'm going. You're kind of mitigating that problem.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that's a great point, Karen. It's not only what you have, it's also what's surrounding your farm too. And that includes wild animals. So things like deer, raccoons, coyotes, those things that obviously will travel through a field because they don't understand the difference. If anything,
they don't care about property lines. Fence, meh.
or they're even attracted to the field. So you have to understand that once you start growing crops, yes, deer are a major nuisance to produce, but they're attracted to it. But with soil amendments, we do talk about adding nutrients to the soil, and a nutrient that you can add to the soil is manure, right? So there's a very big difference between utilizing raw manures versus composted manures. There's a very big difference in incorporating the manure or not incorporating the manure and when you're applying it. So if you're just applying raw manure, it's recommended to be composted is safer. But if, it says raw manure is applied and incorporated into the soil at least 90 to 120 days before harvest. So there's a lot more concerns with raw manure when we're talking about possibility of splash contamination on a produce. So 90 to 120 days is what they're recommending for raw manure usage.
Right. And if you are using composted manure, if you're composting it yourself, you should be tracking to make sure that it has reached the proper temperature for the proper number of days so that it kills any potential bacteria. And if you are purchasing manure and using it on a crop, then you also need to get paperwork from the people producing that manure to say, or that compost, to say that it has been treated properly and proper scientific standards for the destruction of bacterial contamination.
Yes. Yeah, very good. And because there is a proper way to compost, and part of that composting procedure is that those microbes do have to heat up to a certain temperature to kill harmful bacteria in this case, or even weed seeds. We talk about that as well. But for manures, obviously the threat is more in the biological contamination of E. coli. Field sanitation practices would be the next section. So, we're looking at things like pre-harvest risk assessment, that you're examining what your risks are in the field, like what we talked about early on with hand washing, right? So if you're working out in the field, especially during harvest, so at harvest, you're basically just talking about a few days from field to table, right? You don't have 120 days. So you need to make sure that you're really not introducing anything to that, especially E. coli bacteria in the form of coliform bacteria. So making sure that you have the hand washing stations and that they're available, that there are bathroom facilities away from the field, that things are clean, and that you do have sanitizing equipment available for workers. And you have to understand that changes depending on what you're doing, whether you're planting, whether you're harvesting, or anything in between. You're going to have different workers doing different things. But obviously, the closer you are to consumption, the more critical it is to be sanitized.
Right. And when you talk about field sanitation, they're also thinking, go out and do a pre-harvest inspection. Look for wildlife droppings. Look for broken glass or anything that could be a potential contaminant to the crop that you're harvesting. And then mark those locations, and don't harvest if there's poop on the ground there. Have a little ring around it where you're not going to harvest in that area. And that distance is going to be dependent on the size of your farm and what's reasonable for you. Chemical contaminations, you want to think about requirements for pesticide applications. How many days before harvest do you have to apply a pesticide? Or how many days do you have to wait to be able to harvest it? And then you also want to think about chemical soil contamination. You're going to want to check that out well before you plant, as far as if there's any heavy metals in your soil and whatnot. But other things that we really don't think about is like dropped produce. So if you have produce that, let's say you're harvesting tomatoes and you drop one on the ground, well, that tomato was once off the ground, it's now on the ground. It could have potentially rolled through some poop, and so you can no longer sell that tomato. If you want to eat it, that's your prerogative, but you can't sell it into the raw food chain. But if you are processing it, if that all your tomatoes are being made into spaghetti sauce and they're going to be cooked and go through a kill step, that's a little bit different. But you have to have documentation that that's where that dropped produce is going to. Now, if it grows on the ground like a cantaloupe and it's touching the ground, well, that's different, and that's not considered dropped produce just because it's touching the ground. But something we talked about a little bit earlier, we're talking about potential dangers associated with surrounding areas. If you have a low field and there's a flood event, we have one of these big rainstorms, there's a flood event, and water comes up out of the creek and onto your produce. That produce is considered adulterated and cannot enter the food chain. You cannot sell any food that has come in contact with floodwaters. Now, if we get a flash flood and it comes down off the hillside and goes through your produce on the way to the creek, that's not necessarily considered floodwater because it's not holding up everything that was in that creek and bringing it onto your produce. But you do need to consider, okay, what was on that hillside? What could it have washed onto my produce? And you need to make a judgment call at that point. So do be aware of potential contamination events if there is a flooding event. Now, also, of course, if you lose produce due to a flooding event, be sure to reach out to your local FSA office to see if there is any monetary support for the loss of that produce. Usually if it's been declared a, what am I thinking of? a federal emergency zone or something like that, then there's usually some funding to help pay for the lost crops. You can also get crop insurance to help cover that, but that's a whole nother show. So we're going to get back to our food safety plan.
Yeah, the food safety plan as opposed to the government disaster relief stuff. That's all right. So the next step, we are following this template, is
harvesting.
Well, harvesting, it starts with water, and we've talked a lot about the water in our last show. But let's talk about hand harvesting, because it does kind of go into specific things. So gloves are not worn. Workers are required to wash their hands prior to harvesting. So, is that step being monitored? Is everyone educated? Is there somebody that's actually seeing this through to make sure that the compliances are there?
Yeah, and gloves are tricky, right? Because a lot of people think, well, I have gloves on, I don't need to wash my hands, but they are not a substitute, because as you're putting your gloves on, you're still touching the outside of that glove. So you do still need to wash your hands if you're wearing gloves. So that is a critical step.
And there's a difference between reusable gloves and disposable gloves too. So if you're doing it, if you have reusable gloves that you harvest with, something that you can launder, that you are just picking the tomato like as an example and putting it into a basket, are those gloves clean? Is the glove giving you a false sense of security as far as like how clean it actually is? I mean, is it your harvesting gloves, but you just kind of throw them like on a table and they just sit outside for like most of the year and animals sniff them?
Well, even if they just have the soil sitting on them, if that soil had any type of contaminant in it, and you're allowing it, nice, moist, warm environment to breed, then you could be increasing the amount of contamination on those gloves. So you do need to wash your reusable gloves after every harvest.
Yes. And if you're wearing disposable gloves, again, how long have you had them on? Were you smoking like during the break?
Did you touch your face?
Did you? Yeah. Did you?
Just go back to those COVID protocols. And anytime, during COVID, anytime you should have washed your hands, then go back to that, because that is really what we should be doing all the time to help reduce potential contamination.
Like, or tying your shoes, right? Your shoes that are just dragging on the ground. Maybe you stepped in a puddle, and now you're tying your shoes and you're going back to harvesting. Did you introduce whatever was in that puddle outside your field onto all the produce? Keep that in mind.
Yeah, and training your workforce really is the number one thing you can do to help reduce and mitigate food safety risks on your farm. Train everybody who helps to harvest. Even if your mom is coming down for the weekend and just wants to help in the field, and she still needs to be trained. And I know it sounds weird to teach your mom how to wash her hands, but just let them know this is part of your farm food safety plan, and you need it to either maintain your GAP certification or to make sure you're offering safe produce. And you're going to get kickback sometimes, especially for adult workers. But you have to explain to them why it's important. And, there are several tools out there that can help improve trainings and make them easier to do. But worker training really is key, and signage as well, putting signs up just to remind people that they need to be washing their hands and they need to be not harvesting drop produce. Keep those signs up, move them around just to keep people fresh and aware, and make sure that they are trained and you have a record of their training with their signature, the date, and the address of your farm on that document. And if you have other questions about food safety training, farm planning or farm safety planning, anything, reach out to your extension office. Ohio State does have a really great farm food safety plan template that you can find on their website. They also have some online trainings that are available. And of course, every extension office works with food safety. So make sure you reach out. And, some of us are specialized in food safety, so you may get shifted over to a neighboring office. But really do think about what can you do to reduce risks. Even if you don't write a formalized food safety plan, there's things you can do. All right, but we're going to keep going and try to get through in the last 2 minutes here our different steps of the food safety plan.
Yeah. So the totes or the harvesting baskets that you're putting the fruit in. Is it something that's clean? Is it something that I know you're just getting it from the field to the packing house or whatever, where like they're washing the produce and they're doing all that. But, is that tote even a form of contamination? So think about that. Make sure everything's clean the entire time.
Yeah, the truck can be a source of contamination too, especially if you use it for hauling livestock or livestock feed. Again, livestock feed doesn't have the same food safety protocol as human feed. So it's important to recognize that if you have one truck for the farm, that you do need to clean it between activities. And you can put a tarp down or something to help add an extra layer of protection between your produce and your vehicle.
Absolutely. Yes.
Hey friends, we need your help. In order to help keep this show going, we need to hear back from you. Please take some time and check out our evaluation. You can either contact us directly for a copy, or you can go online to https:// here's the tricky part, capitalize the next 3 words. Extension, calling, evaluation. Again, extension, calling, and evaluation all need to be capitalized. So bit.ly/extension, calling, evaluation. Give us your thoughts. Let us know if you like the show, and especially let us know if you've used any of the information you've gained from our show. Once again, you can reach us directly. You can call Karen at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Or you can reach Dan at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Let us know how you use the information that you get from this show, whether it is change in your shopping habits, a change in your gardening, or simply just expanding your mind. We want to know. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.